Schweinfurt, Germany, October 14, 1943. Oberleutnant Mount Heint climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 fighter at V-Boten airfield. Intelligence had warned that a major American bomber raid was approaching, possibly the largest yet. No had flown dozens of intercept missions against American bombers over the past months. He knew what to expect: formations of 200 or 300 B-7 flying fortresses. Heavily armed but vulnerable, once German fighters penetrated their defensive formations. No took off with his squadron, 12 Bf-109s tasked with intercepting the incoming raid. As he climbed to altitude over central Germany, ground control radioed updates in the American formation. The numbers kept increasing. First report, 300 bombers, then revised 400 bombers, then 500. No assumed the reports were exaggerated. Ground observers often overestimated formation sizes when they saw multiple bomber streams. Then he reached 25,000 FT and saw the American formation himself. The sky was filled with bombers, not the usual concentrated formation of a few hundred aircraft. This was different. Multiple bomber streams stretched across the horizon. Hundreds of B-17s in tight defensive boxes stacked at various altitudes covering miles of airspace. The condensation trails from their engines created a white grid across the sky. No radioed his wingman. "How many do you count?" The response came back. "I stopped counting at 300. There are more behind them." This wasn't a typical bombing mission. This was an aerial armada that dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe had encountered before. What No was witnessing was the culmination of American industrial mobilization and strategic bombing doctrine. The United States had spent 1942 to 1943 building bomber production capacity, training crews, and establishing bases in England. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force could launch raids of unprecedented scale. The mission No was intercepting, the Second Schweinfurt Raid, involved 291 B-17 bombers. But when combined with escort fighters, support aircraft, and multiple bomber streams attacking different targets simultaneously, the total American aircraft over Germany that day exceeded $1,000. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and devastating. No and his fellow Luftwaffe fighters had grown accustomed to numerical superiority, or at least parity with American formations. German fighters would attack in coordinated groups, picking off stragglers and pressing attacks until bombers broke formation. The tactics worked when German fighters outnumbered or equaled American defensive firepower. But against 1,000 American aircraft, numerical superiority was impossible. The Luftwaffe had approximately 800 single-engine fighters defending all of Germany that day. Even if every available fighter was concentrated against this single raid, which was impossible because German forces had to defend multiple targets, they'd still be outnumbered. And the Americans were just getting started. This was one raid. Tomorrow there would be another and another. The production numbers were overwhelming. No positioned for an attack run on one of the bomber boxes. Standard German tactics called forehead-on attacks from 12 knock high. Diving through the formation at high speed, firing at the lead bombers, then breaking away before defensive gunners could track effectively. No dove toward the formation, lined up his shot, and opened fire. The bomber he targeted, one of dozens in the box, shuddered as his 20 cannon shells struck the nose and wing. But the bomber held formation. Behind it, 10 more bombers continued undisturbed. No pulled up to avoid collision and defensive fire, then climbed for another attack. He looked back and counted. He damaged 1 bomber out of 30 in that box, and there were dozens of boxes. The mathematics were brutal. Even if every German fighter shot down 1 bomber per mission, an optimistically high success rate, they destroy perhaps 100 to 150 bombers. The Americans would lose 10 to 15% of their force. Painful but sustainable. And the next day, American factories would begin replacing those losses, while German factories struggled to replace fighters destroyed in the same battle. The defensive firepower from 1,000 American aircraft was overwhelming. Each B-17 carried 1050 caliber machine guns manned by trained gunners. A bomber box of 30 B-7s could bring 300 machine guns to bear on attacking fighters. Approaching such concentrated firepower meant flying through a storm of bullets. German pilots who'd previously pressed attack aggressively now found themselves breaking off earlier, unwilling to risk flying through the defensive fire. No made 3 attack runs, expending all his ammunition. He claimed 2 bombers damaged, possibly destroyed. Then his fuel ran low. Combat at high altitude consumed fuel rapidly. He broke off and returned to base to refuel and rearm. By the time he could launch again, the American bombers would be over their targets or already heading home. On the ground that Wyss bought him, no other pilots discussed what they'd seen. The consensus was shocked disbelief. The Americans had launched over 1,000 aircraft in a single day. The Luftwaffe couldn't sustain such operations. German aircraft production, pilot training, and fuel supplies couldn't support daily missions of this magnitude. Yet the Americans apparently could. And this was just one raid from one air force. The Americans had additional bomber forces in Italy, the Pacific, and still building up in England. The Second Schweinfurt Raid on October 14, 1943 resulted in heavy American losses. 60 bombers shot down and 17 more damaged beyond repair. By traditional military calculations, losing 77 bombers out of 291, 26% loss rate was unsustainable. The Luftwaffe celebrated the day as an offensive victory. German propaganda reported crushing the American raid and destroying their bombing capability. But German commanders analyzing the strategic situation understood the truth. Yes, they'd shot down 60 bombers, but the Americans had put 291 bombers over Germany in one day. Tomorrow, American factories would begin replacing those 60 losses. Within weeks, replacement aircraft and crews would arrive. The lost bombers would be recovered. Meanwhile, Germany had lost approximately 40 fighters, destroying those bombers. Fighters that would take months to replace with pilots that were irreplaceable. Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, reviewed reports of the October 14th raid and recognized the strategic implications. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The day I saw reports of 1,000 American aircraft over Germany, I knew we'd lost the air war. We could shoot down bombers at rates that would make any other nation stop the campaign. But the Americans just kept coming. More bombers, more fighters, more crews. We were fighting an enemy with unlimited resources. The American ability to launch 1,000 aircraft raids represented more than just industrial capacity. It demonstrated a completely different approach to warfare. German military doctrine emphasized quality, superior aircraft, elite pilots, tactical excellence. German fighters were individually superior to many American aircraft. German pilots received extensive training. German tactics were refined and effective, but American doctrine emphasized quantity and sustainability. American aircraft weren't always the best individual performers, but they were produced in vast numbers. American pilots weren't always as experienced as German veterans, but the training pipeline produced thousands of replacements. American tactics emphasized formation discipline and mutual support over individual heroics. Result was a system that could absorb losses that would other nations and continue fighting. Losing 60 bombers in one day was painful but not crippling. Losing 40 fighters in one day was manageable for America, but catastrophic for Germany. The attrition mathematics favored the side with superior production and replacement capacity. By November 1943, the pattern was established. American raids of 300 to 500 bombers became routine. On some days, multiple raids targeted different objectives. One bomber stream attacking industrial targets while another hit transportation infrastructure. German fighters had to disperse to defend multiple targets, reducing concentration against any single raid. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts in early 1944 made the situation worse for Germany. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. Now, German fighters not only faced overwhelming bomber numbers, they also faced skilled fighter escorts that could protect the bombers and hunt German interceptors. The psychological toll on German pilots was severe. No's diary entries from late 1943 and early 1944 documented increasing despair. He described watching bomber streams pass overhead, knowing he couldn't stop them. He wrote about friends killed in futile attempts to break through escort fighters to reach bombers. He questioned whether continuing the fight served any purpose when defeat seemed inevitable. German fighter pilot casualties escalated dramatically. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 8,000 fighter pilots killed, seriously wounded, or captured. This was more than the total number of fighter pilots Germany had at the beginning of 1943. The losses should have eliminated German fighter forces entirely, but desperate measures kept units operational. Pilot training was compressed, reducing the time from enlistment to combat assignment from 18 months to as little as 6 months. This produced barely competent pilots who lacked the skills to survive combat against experienced American crews. These replacement pilots often died on their first or second missions, requiring constant recruitment of new replacements who were equally unprepared. Fuel shortages constrained training further. By 1944, German pilot training programs had to reduce flight hours because aviation fuel was needed for combat operations. Pilots reached operational units with inadequate practice, making them even more vulnerable. The spiral was self-reinforcing. Inadequate training led to higher casualties, requiring more replacements who received even less training. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs expanded. By 1944, the United States was training over 100,000 pilots per year, far more than needed to replace combat losses. American pilots reached combat units with hundreds off-flight hours. They'd practice gunnery, formation flying, navigation, and combat tactics extensively before facing enemy fighters. The economic disparity was staggering. American aircraft production in 1944 exceeded 96,000 aircraft of all types. German production was approximately 40,000 aircraft. American pilots logged more training hours than German pilots had total flight time. American factories produced aluminum, aviation fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in quantities that dwarfed German capacity. No survived the war, one of relatively few Luftwaffe fighter pilots who flew continuously from 1941 to 1945 and lived. His memoir described the evolution from confidence to despair. In 1941 to 1942, German pilots believed they were winning. In 1943, they recognized the war was becoming difficult, but still thought victory was possible. By 1944, most pilots understood they were losing, but continued fighting out of duty, desperation, or inability to see alternatives. The October 14, 1943 raid, when German pilots first saw truly massive American bomber formations, marked a psychological turning point. Before that day, German pilots believed they could defend German airspace through skill and determination. After that day, they understood they were fighting an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The 1,000 aircraft figure became symbolic for German pilots. Whether the exact count was 900, 1,000, or 1,100 didn't matter. What mattered was the scale. Formations so large they filled the sky, representing industrial capacity beyond anything Germany could match. American commanders understood the psychological impact. General Curtis Lame, who led many of these massive raids, later wrote, "We knew that putting 1,000 aircraft over Germany would demoralize their defenders. Even if we took heavy losses, it demonstrated that we had unlimited resources. They could shoot down 100 bombers, and we'd send 200 tomorrow. Eventually, they'd run out of fighters, fuel, or pilots." The strategy worked. By spring 1944, German fighter resistance had weakened significantly despite desperate efforts to maintain defenses. Veteran pilots were dead or incapacitated. Replacements lacked skills to be effective. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Industrial bombing damaged production facilities. The Luftwaffe that had dominated Europeanskis in 1939-1941 was a shadow of its former capability. The progression was clear in German records. In early 1943, Luftwaffe fighter units typically shot down 5 to 10% of attacking bombers, a respectable defensive success rate. By mid-1943, this had dropped to 3 to 5%. By early 1944, it was often below 2%. Not because German pilots weren't fighting. They were. But because American formations were so large, so well-protected, and so numerous that even heroic defensive efforts couldn't stop them. Noki's final diary entry about bomber formations came in March 1945. He described watching a raid pass overhead without attempting to intercept. His unit had no fuel for combat operations. The bombers flew to their targets undisturbed while German fighters sat grounded. He wrote, "We've lost, not because we lack courage or skill, but because they have more of everything than we can possibly counter." The German pilots who first saw 1,000 American bombers in October 1943 understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't a temporary surge or maximum effort. This was sustainable American capability that would continue day after day until Germany was defeated. The industrial disparity that Admiral Yamamoto had warned about when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor was now destroying Germany from the air. Germany's war production continued fighting until the end, producing aircraft, training pilots, and defending against raids. But the outcome was determined by mathematics and industrial capacity. America could build man and operate 1,000 aircraft raids routinely. Germany couldn't stop them. The day German pilots saw that reality in the sky above them was the day they knew air superiority was lost permanently. October 14, 1943. The day the sky filled with American bombers. The day German pilots stopped counting at 300. The day they understood that courage and skill couldn't overcome industrial superiority. The day Germany lost the air war even though the fighting would continue for 18 more months.